Good afternoon, it's John Livingston and Jeff Newsfarm putting together a webinar on the RDMC product suite, and today we're concentrating on patch deployment and showing our clients how and what the functionality involves. I'll hand over to Jeff and let him take over and show you where we're and how we work.
Okay, thanks John. This will be a follow-up to last month's webinar where we covered the basic application deployment techniques. So today we're going to look at two things. First off, we're going to look at some of the slightly more advanced features in application deployment, specifically what they are and where you would typically use them. We'll then also take a look at the patch management features within RDMC. In order to use the patch management features, you also need to have some understanding of the way Windows identifies applications within the registry. So we will cover that quickly as well, just to give an idea of how to set up patches appropriately. So we'll start with the application deployment. Within RDMC there are several different methods that you can use to deploy an application. Now to demonstrate this, if I jump into a device collection, the good thing is we can start recording again.
We just have a look at...
But it looks like we've actually got a little problem here. I lost my network connectivity to the server. I think we're going to have to start again. So give me one sec. I shall stop this and we'll start again, I think.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's John Livingston and Jeff Newsfarm from SOESoft. We're today demonstrating the RDMC product suite and specifically concentrating on patch deployment. Jeff's our technical advisor, and I'll hand over to Jeff and get him to go through how and what it functions and does. Jeff.
Thanks very much, John. Okay, in last month's webinar we looked at the application deployment functionality within RDMC. We touched on the ways to deploy an application and how to actually prepare an application for deployment. In this webinar we'll be looking at two different factors. One will be the advanced methods for deploying an application. There are several methods within the console for deploying apps, and we'll look at what those are and the situations under which you would use each one. We'll then also take a look at the patch deployment, and in order to use patch deployment within RDMC you need to have a reasonable understanding of the way Windows stores application data in the registry, so we will touch on that as well. So we'll start by looking at the advanced application deployment options. When you go to deploy an application, you can specify a number of different methods. The method that you use depends on whether or not you want the user to be aware of the application deployment going on, and in some cases will also depend on the application itself and what its requirements are. So if we start up an application deployment, one of the first options that comes up is installation details. Now this is an important one. This window will determine how the application deployment will appear, or more to the point, if it will appear visible to the user. You've got three options here. Your visible installer administrator will cause the PC to optionally display a message, log the user off, reboot, log back in automatically with the keyboard and mouse locked. It will log in as an administrative user, perform the installation, then shut down and restart with the keyboard and mouse enabled again. The second method, visible installer current user, is not one that gets used very often, but on occasions it can be necessary. That one will actually install under the context of the user who is currently logged onto the system. Now this does have some limitations. If the application that's being deployed requires administrative rights and the current logged on user doesn't have administrative rights, this option won't work. However, there are a number of particularly older applications that must be installed under the context of the user that will be running the application. That would be the situation in which you would use the current user visible installer. The third and the most common type is silent installer administrator. This runs as a Windows service. This means that it runs with administrative privileges and it is completely invisible to the user. This is the one people use the majority of the time. It allows you to push out patches, updates, even entire new applications without the user actually being aware that the maintenance is being performed. The first they will know about it is when the icon appears on the start menu or desktop if the application has one. You can also use it to do things like, for example, push out emergency updates to virus stat files and things like that, which you don't necessarily want the user to be aware is going on. So a couple of different considerations when deciding which method to use. The majority of applications will install fine using the administrative install. There are, however, a few exceptions. Again, they do tend to be older applications. Quite often you won't know which ones they are until you test them, but if you find one that absolutely refuses to install under the service account, then try pushing it out as using the visible installer. The most common reasons you would want to use the visible installation method is if the deployment requires reboots. This is obviously not something you can hide, so you need to use a visible installation method. Secondly, you would also use it in a case that you're deploying something that requires that the user is not running a particular piece of software. An example to this would be if you were pushing out a service pack update to Microsoft Office. This cannot be applied if Microsoft Office is running at the time, so using the visible installer, make sure that the machine is rebooted, logged on without any of those applications running, and allows the patch to be installed successfully. So these would be the most common reasons, and the reboots and the scripts are can be an important requirement. Remember that when you're deploying applications, you're not necessarily deploying a single application, but a number of steps. That could be an application plus several plugins, it could be multiple applications, and in several cases you will require one or more reboots throughout the process. When you build your deployment script, if you include the reboots, the visible installer method will reboot the machine at the appropriate points in time, and then automatically reboot at the end of the process to allow the user to log back in. In addition, then we'll also take a look at some of the other installer options and where you might use those. Ordinarily, the standard installer options, the default ones, would be fine. Specifically, this option here, use Next Free Drive. When we install applications, by default, we map a drive letter to the server and run the installation off there. Now, in a moment, we'll look at a couple of reasons that you may actually not want to use that method. If you're using the drive letter method, you can specify this option, which tells it simply to use whatever drive letter is currently available. Or if you untick that, you can specify which drive letter you want it to use. This will have a problem, however, if the machine is logging on and the administrative profile maps a drive to that letter already. It won't then be able to use it and the installation may fail as a result. There can be some downsides to using a drive letter deployment. For most applications it's the easiest way, but if you're installing an application that potentially needs to access its installation source off the network at a later time, and again an example of this could be Microsoft Office, which may run a per user setup when each new user logs into the machine, it needs to be able to find the installation source. Where this becomes a problem is that if you've used a drive letter to perform the installation, come the time that the installer needs to reconnect to the server, that drive letter won't be mapped anymore. Therefore it won't be able to find it and the reinstallation will fail. In that particular case, make sure that this option is set. Use UNC path for installations. This will force it to use the full name of the server and the share when accessing the installer. That then becomes a path that's stored in the registry, and it means that at a later time, if it does need to reattach to the installation source, that it will be able to find it again. Now, in some cases you will actually want to have, in most cases you will want to have the drive letter mapped even if you're not using it. You can specify not to. Now the reason that you would use this is for security. When we perform a UNC connection, we don't specify a username and password. If the share containing the software is protected and the admin account that you're logging into doesn't have access to it, then again that will fail because security won't be there. In that particular case, you want to make certain that this option is not selected. When it maps the drive letter, it will use the username and password to connect to the share, and as a result it will definitely have access to the files that it needs, even though it's actually using the UNC path to perform the installation itself. A couple of other options to look at here. I've mentioned before that when you're performing a visible installation, you can specify optional messages, which we'll look at in a moment. These messages typically will display for a period of time that you specify, say 5 minutes, prior to the installation, giving the user the option to reboot the machine immediately or wait until that period of time is expired, at which time it will reboot automatically. If you don't want that to happen, you want the installation to proceed immediately upon the installation starting, simply tick this box. It won't display the message and it won't wait for the user and give the user the appropriate amount of time. This of course can be dangerous if you're planning on doing a visible installation, because it does mean the user's machine will be rebooted without warning and potentially close down any applications that they have open, presumably without saving them. You can also specify auto log off device once the installation process is finished. This one is done automatically when you're performing an administrative visible installation. It doesn't really apply when you're doing a service-based. However, under current user one, it does apply. Typically speaking, you won't want to have that on. You would be assuming that the user was logged on at the time that you started the deployment, and therefore you would be leaving them logged on at